Welcome to this evening panel on the Leonine Revival, looking at the pontificate of Leo XIV through the lens of Pope Leo XIII's writings. This panel is moderated by Dr. Andrew Abella of the Bush School of Business, a great friend of the Napa Institute. I'll introduce Dean Abella, and he will give a word or two about our other great panelists, Catherine Pacolic, Ryan Anderson, Father Robert Sirico, and Father Gregory Pine. Dr. Abella is the founding dean of the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America. He is also a faculty affiliate at the Harvard University Human Flourishing Program and a contributor at Forbes.com. He recently served as provost and chief academic officer at Catholic U, and his research on the integrity of the marketing process, including marketing ethics, Catholic social doctrine, and internal communication, has been published in several academic journals, including the Journal of Marketing, the Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science, the Journal of Business Ethics, and the Journal of Markets and Morality, as well as in 2 books. He is the winner of the 2009 Novak Award, a $10,000 prize given by the Acton Institute for significant contributions to the study of the relationship between religion and economic liberty. We have a representative from Acton here, I think. So, his 2 most recent books are Super Habits, The Universal System for a Successful Life from Sophia Press, which you have to pick up. It really is a game changer for virtue, and A Catechism for Business from Catholic University Press. Dr. Abella also provides consulting and training in internal communications to Fortune 100 corporations. Prior to his academic career, he spent several years in industry as brand manager at Procter & Gamble, management consultant with McKinsey & Company, and managing director of the Marketing Leadership Council of the Corporate Executive Board. He and his wife Kathleen have 6 children and live in Virginia. Please give a warm welcome for Dean Abella.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. If you notice that I'm shivering, it's not because I'm nervous, because you're all very nice people, but it's bloody freezing out there. That's okay. I'm still trying to get the warmth into my bones, so I'm glad the room is full, because the body heat will keep us all warm. So the inspiration for this panel was to explore the thought of Leo XIII and see what it might suggest to us, what we might expect from Leo XIV, because we know that he chose the name in honor of Leo XIII. And the way to do this is we're going to be looking at 4 of Pope Leo XIII's encyclicals. Each of our panelists will be talking about one of them, and kind of trying to see what we learn from that encyclical and what it might suggest for the future. I will introduce the panelists. Immediately to my right is Father Gregory Pine, who is Assistant Director of the Thomistic Institute, which many of you know, and a regular contributor to several excellent podcasts, including what I think is the delightfully named Godsplaining, so one of my favorite. To his right is Dr. Ryan Anderson, President of EPPC, who lives in Virginia with his wife, 5 kids, and over 100 animals. And I don't think you're referring there to your Loudoun County neighbors, right? No, right, okay. So, next to his right is Dr. Catherine Pacolic, who is a professor with me at the Bush School. Catherine worked earlier in her life at the National Institutes of Health while she was in college in the viral epidemiology branch of the National Cancer Institute, and co-authored 2 papers on HIV and cancer, which apparently her experience there led her to study economics. So if you want to make that connection, you have to ask her why afterwards. And then to the far right, for the first time, Father, first ever. Father Robert Sirico. I want to point out, not only is he the President Emeritus and co-founder of the Acton Institute, which gives out the Novak Award, Catherine is also a Novak awardee. I'm very proud of the fact that the Bush School of Business has more Novak awardees on its staff, on its faculty, than any other business school in the entire world. So there we go. Very proud of that. So let me give you just a very quick, I know you all know about Pope Leo XIII, but I have just a few key points. You all know he was elected in 1878. He was 68 years old, which we now know is younger than Tim Bush, as Tim told us. He was at the time in frail health, Pope Leo, not Tim. Tim is very healthy. And Pope Leo XIII was expected to have a short papacy. He was sort of a stopgap pope. It's difficult for us today to understand in just what a poor light the Catholic Church was seen by the rest of the world in 1878. There's a famous line about a French journalist who said something to the effect of, this was the last gasp of a dying institution. That line is false. He never actually said that. It's just a paraphrase. What he actually said was something almost as aggressive. On his decision to go and attend to see this new pope, he said, many of us wondered whether we were witnessing an ending rather than a beginning. More than one unbeliever had come saying to himself, let's go and see this. It may be the last one. They thought he might be the last pope. Fortunately, they were very wrong. We can agree that it is how wrong they were, but quite a bit of how wrong they were, I think, can be attributed to the successful pontificate of Leo XIII. He basically set up the Catholic Church for a very successful 20th century and now, God willing, 21st century as well. By God's grace, his papacy lasted over 25 years, so some stopgap, right, until 1903. He was hugely productive. Encyclical letters, as you know, are one among the most significant teaching documents that a pope can write. It's a good measure of his productivity. He issued 90 of them, 90, which collectively are almost as many as all of the popes since then, including John Paul II, who we knew had quite a few of those, you know. So immensely productive as a pope. We are going to focus on just 4 of these 90 because we only have all night. we have less than an hour. Dr. Anderson will be focusing on Libertas, which is on liberty. Dr. Pakaluk on Arcanum, which is his first encyclical on marriage and family. Father Sirico on Rerum Novarum, which is on the economy. And Father Pine, who will go first, will actually be talking about the encyclical Aeterni Patris, which is on the return of the restoration of Christian philosophy. So each panelist will introduce their encyclical, drawing from other resources as necessary, and we'll lay out some thoughts on the implications of that encyclical and Leo's pontificate for the pontificate of Leo XIV. So we'll start with you, Father Gregory Pine, on Aeterni Patris. So why St. Thomas specifically, which is what this substantively this encyclical is about? Why St. Thomas, and what does he have over other doctors of the Church, of whom there are so many and so great?
So the encyclical Aeterni Patris was published on the 4th of August in the year 1879, so just 18 months after Pope Leo XIII was elected. And it began, or it really gave impetus to a revival of Thomism, which you haven't heard of Thomism. It's a kind of approach to the Catholic intellectual tradition, which takes St. Thomas Aquinas as its leading light. And it's not a mere matter of kind of patriotism, like he's our guy and we support him. But there's a kind of deference there to St. Thomas as a wise, a good, a holy teacher and preacher. So Pope Leo had, during his life and through his friendships and various connections, profited from Thomism in his own formation, and it gave him entry to the riches of the Catholic intellectual tradition, which afforded him a certainty and a confidence as a pastor and as a preacher, and he wanted to kind of reinstate that clarity at the heart of the Church's doctrinal life. And so his own brother, Giuseppe Pecci, was a well-known Thomist of the day, and one of his collaborators in various projects, Tommaso Maria Zigliara, was another famous one of a similar sort. And so you might ask the question, why is it necessary that Thomism return? Shouldn't it always reign supreme? There had been seasons in the Church's life from when St. Thomas lived and died until the time in which Aeterni Patris was published, when it had come into prominence and then perhaps retreated to the background of the Church's intellectual life. So St. Thomas himself lived from 1225 until 1274. And at the end of his life, there was some controversy, not only about these mendicant orders, these upstart crows, but about some of his teachings. And it was kind of, broadly speaking, a controversy in the university center about how philosophy and theology were meant to communicate or mutually enrich. And so there were some condemnations that came down in 1270 and 1277, and so it became necessary for the church to discern over the course of those years following his death what was true and what was false. And in the course of those series of discernments, St. Thomas kind of rose to the top. And so he was declared a saint in 1323. And then there was really a heyday of Thomism in the 16th century. You may have heard of the Second Scholasticism, associated in a big way with the Iberian Peninsula, with what we would consider now Spain and Portugal, but which really went throughout Europe and into the New World. And you see a kind of triumph or a triumphant moment during the Council of Trent, which met in 3 sessions between the 1540s and the 1560s, in which, in addition to sacred scripture and the kind of bulls of the Holy Roman Pontiffs, the Summa Theologiae, St. Thomas's masterwork, was placed on the altar there during the kind of convention or the convening of the Council Fathers. And Trent was left for its application to Pope St. Pius V, who reigned from 1566 to 1572 and was himself a Dominican friar. So he oversaw the kind of reforms of Trent in an especially Thomistic mode. But in the years following the 16th and 17th century, there had kind of been a period of decline, both in the intellectual life of the church and in Thomism, which parallels with certain Enlightenment movements, whereby the church's teaching was eclipsed, and even some of the church's teaching was kind of muddled or muddied by a kind of syncretism or by a use of philosophical tools which weren't especially well disposed to the explication of the faith. And so we'll hear in subsequent presentations about kind of the cultural revolution and societal revolution, which led to a clarification as to the church's social teaching and the church's teaching on liberty and specifically on marriage. But you saw here also a time of kind of manifest philosophical error, which led subsequently to theological error. And you can see this really come or take definitive shape in modernism, which became a focus of the Holy Roman Pontiff in the late 19th and early 20th century. So maybe just a final word before handing it on to our next speaker. I think what you see in Aeterni Patris is a helpful use of the Holy Father's teaching authority, in which he clarifies for the church the way in which she can profit from all of the gifts that God has given. And God, having made us to his image and likeness, has made us capable of knowing him and loving him. And our knowledge of him is mediated through our exercise of reason, because that's the very thing with which he has blessed us, whereby to come into the fullness of the truth. And so in the teaching of Aeterni Patris, which is a short encyclical, we said that he published 90 encyclicals, and many of them are of a very readable length, which is a great teaching tool for pastors and preachers the world over. But in that document, he highlights the importance of philosophy, and he'll kind of touch on it from various angles or with various approaches. But we can think of philosophy as serving 4 main roles in the service of sacred doctrine or faith discourse, broadly speaking. 1, it helps us to clarify the doctrines themselves. So you can think about how philosophical tools help St. Thomas Aquinas give a coherent account of our Trinitarian faith or our Christological faith. 2nd, there's a way in which philosophy can help us to explain how the teachings of the faith illumine our human condition. So like, for instance, original sin is a revealed doctrine, but you can use kind of arguments taken from reason to help people, who are launching utopian projects to better appreciate why they probably won't work if they don't adequately account for our fallen nature, right? So explaining the doctrinal coherence, showing how the doctrines illumine our human condition. The next we refer to as the preambles of the faith. There are certain things which, by our use of reason, we can know and we can prove. And some of these things are actually revealed. So there's a kind of overlap between what we can prove and what is revealed to us, because God, in his infinite loving kindness, has seen fit to provide us with such a superabundance of resources that he wanted to make sure that we don't get these things wrong. So one of them, which had just been clarified at the First Vatican Council, is the existence of God. We can know that God exists by our exercise of reason. Mind you, it's difficult to do so, Probably going to take us a while. We're going to have to rely on smart people to do it. There's probably going to be some errors mixed in, but we can reason to that. Okay, so this is something that we can do by the exercise of reason, in which philosophy can facilitate. And then the fourth and final is signs of credibility. We can use our reason to look at the testimony of history and all things besides and say, there's something going on here. So like the confluence of prophecy in the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, or the continuity of the church's teaching. What's going on here? We can use our reason to unpack that in service of faith discourse, or sacra doctrina, as St. Thomas calls it. So with this Aeterni Patris, Pope Leo XIII gave a kind of new certainty and new confidence to faith discourse by reorienting it by the use of these most excellent resources, which the church's tradition had availed subsequent Christians or subsequent generations of. And he also uncovers some of its doctrinal and evangelical import. So I think that one of the greatest testimonies that we can give as Christians is not just the mere fact, which is a great fact, that God knows us and loves us, but that we've been capacitated with an agency whereby to know and love him in return, not just a mere matter of our kind of human lights and insights, but as a God-given gift whereby to respond generously to his offering of himself. And so Pope Leo, in the opening of his pontificate, made sure to lay a great foundation, or a kind of great philosophical and theological basis, whereby to kind of pave the way for the reception of subsequent teachings which would speak into these various problems encountered in the culture and in society more broadly.
Thank you, Father. I'd like to move now to Ryan Anderson. Dr. Anderson, so you will speak on Libertas, the encyclical on liberty. We're Americans, we like liberty. What did Pope Leo XIII have to say about liberty?
Sure, thank you. Let me start with some show and tell. A dozen of those encyclicals, he wrote over 90, are in this volume. It's called The Pope Speaks to the Modern World. It was originally published around 1950. It has a great introduction and then summaries of these encyclicals by Etienne Gilson, who was a great mid-century Thomist. I've been rereading this volume since Pope Leo XIV announced his name. Yeah, give it to Father Pine. But if you want to, all four of the encyclicals that we are talking about today are included in that volume, plus an additional 8. So if all you know about Pope Leo XIII is Rerum Novarum, there are 11 other encyclicals you can read in this volume, and then if you want to dig even deeper, you can print out the other 80-some. I've been asked to talk about Libertas, and I thought giving some kind of groundwork of the context in which Pope Leo is writing. So this comes out 9 years after the encyclical on Thomism that Father Gregory just spoke of. So it comes out 1888. And to set kind of the intellectual groundwork, J.S. Mill publishes his book on liberty in 1859. If you know anything about Mill, Mill is a utilitarian, and the master principle of On Liberty is that every one of us should be free to do whatever we want to do, provided we don't harm another person. And by harm another person, he doesn't mean moral harm, he doesn't mean spiritual harm, he means like tangible physical harm. J.S. Mill is the one who promoted the idea of experiments in living. We shouldn't be bound by any natural law or eternal law or anything like that. We should all be our own kind of like self-author, and we should be experimenting with liberty, provided our freedom doesn't hurt anyone else, right? So my freedom to swing my hand stops at your nose, but no other moral limits, right? So that's one radical individualism, radical autonomy vision. All right, another current that's in the era that he's responding to, Karl Marx, Communist Manifesto comes out in 1848. All right, so Marx, this will have more to do, I think, with Father Robert's presentation tonight. But look, he says religion is the opium of the people. He says that we're all operating under false consciousness, that for us to experience liberty, we actually need to free ourselves of religion, which is just the powerful holding us back. Natural law, which is again is a class warfare. Those who are in power are telling us that we have to respect their private property rights. We have to respect bourgeois morality, et cetera, et cetera. And then also realize this is only 100 years after the French Revolution, right? And so if you think of the three French words, liberté, égalité, fraternité, that's not the vision of liberty that Pope Leo is offering. The way that I like to summarize the French Revolution is the quote from Denis Diderot, "Man will never be free till the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest." right? So like that's the vision of what freedom would look like. Both church and state would be dissolved. All right. So what Leo wants to say, and what he says in Libertas, is the church has been a perennial defender of authentic human liberty, and anything that is good in modern depictions of liberty, the church has always been defending. But the church now needs to criticize the excesses of modern theories of liberty. He divides this into two concepts, what he calls natural liberty, which is simply, why are we as human beings, why do we say that we're a free species? As Andrew mentioned, we have over 100 animals on our property. These are like cows and pigs and ducks and chickens and lambs and goats and other animals. None of them are free animals because none of them are rational animals, right? So why we have natural liberty, it's precisely because we have a rational intellectual nature. The metaphysical principle of this, as Aquinas would say, as Leo says, is that we have an immaterial soul, which means we're not driven by blind passion. We're not just driven by our impulses. We're not just driven by our desires. We can reason about what is good, and then our rational will can choose what we know to be good. So that then leads Leo to talk about what he refers to as moral liberty. Moral liberty is not the freedom to do whatever you want to do, right? It's the freedom of actually choosing what you ought to do. And so Leo draws a distinction between liberty and license, something that every one of the American founders would have drawn a distinction between, something that many of our politicians today can't draw a distinction between. This is why when I think what Leo XIV will have to teach us as an American now in Rome, especially next year being the 250th anniversary of the founding of our country, that distinction between liberty and license. Right? We can go wrong either because we choose an end that isn't good for us, it's not fitting for our rational nature, or because we choose bad means. Right? So this is, if you're at all familiar with a more contemporary Thomist moral theologian, Servas Pincers, a Dominican theologian, it's the distinction he draws between freedom for excellence and the freedom of indifference. Right? The distinction between a freedom that is actually oriented us towards what is truly good for us, where we choose an end that is fitting for our nature and means that are appropriate for it, versus the choose your own adventure, do whatever you want conception of freedom. America's founding had, I think, the freedom for excellence conception. America of today has the freedom of indifference conception. All right, next thing to say, Leo says, wait, so if the reason that we are a free animal is because we're an intellectual animal, and if freedom is perfected by choosing the good, then this means we need law. Because law is nothing but an ordinance of reason for the common good, promulgated by one who has authority for the common good, if you get the full Thomistic definition of reason. So this means anyone who tries to say that law is at odds with freedom has a false theory of freedom. So think of all the antinomians that want to pit freedom at odds with law, that law is somehow a limit to our freedom. What Leo argues is that law is what actually makes freedom possible, because law is what directs us towards our ends and towards the means that we ought to choose for our end. In the focal case, he's talking about the natural law, right? The law written on the heart, the rational law that all of us as rational creatures participate in. Next paragraph, he goes a step deeper and he says, look, and the natural law is nothing but the rational creature's participation in the eternal law, right? So this is straight out of Aquinas. I'd also argue this is right at home in America, because when MLK is in the Birmingham jail, MLK, a Baptist minister, who does he cite? He cites two Catholic theologians, Augustine and Aquinas. What does he cite them as saying? Augustine, an unjust law is no law at all. Aquinas, how do we know the difference? A just law is a man-made law that's in harmony with the natural law and the eternal law. Right? So Leo is saying in 1888, exactly more or less what MLK will say almost less than 100 years later. And so there can be some synergy here as Americans as we think through the best of what America could be. All right. Before I run out of time, I'll just add, he then says, look, the same thing needs to be true for human law. Right? If your conception of liberty is in essence anarchy, that man is most free when he has least law, you actually don't yet have a sound understanding of what law is supposed to order us towards the common good. And so there's going to be certain rules of the road. We can have too much law. We can have bad law. We can have unjust laws. But we can also be in a situation where we don't have the necessary legal protections. And I think this is more the Marxian, the cultural revolution, the class warfare, the idea that all of morality and therefore all of positive law, human law, is just a matter of power politics. He's more responding to that in that context, I think. Leo in Libertas is a critic of a certain form of democracy where it's sheer majority rule. And this made me immediately think of Lincoln's debate with Stephen Douglas, where Stephen Douglas says about slavery, well, look, I don't care whether the territories vote it up or vote it down. Whatever the majority wants, that's what the territory should get. And then Lincoln's response is, wait a minute, you can't say that you would just as soon see a wrong voted up as voted down. If you think it's wrong, then the law shouldn't be protecting it, right? And this is what Leo's getting at. For human law, for democracy to be possible, it can't just be sheer majority rule. The majority needs to be informed by the natural law and the eternal law. I'm guessing I'm running out of time just because it feels like I've gone about the right. There's more to say. There's more to say about liberalism. There's more to say about certain civil liberties, how to think through this. I just want to close by saying, a couple areas that I think Leo XIV has already hinted that he's going to be focused on. One is when he picked the name Leo XIV, he said, if Leo XIII was operating in the context of the Industrial Revolution, my papacy is in the context of the technological revolution. And he's already highlighted that artificial intelligence, large language models are going to be on the table. First thing to say there is they're not actually intelligent. They don't have an immaterial soul. They don't actually have freedom, which means we as people who are intelligent and free need to think about how do we govern AI. Which leads to the second point, the natural law is going to be key here. I think we're due for another natural law revival. The natural law comes and goes. It's never defeated. It has these natural law moments. I think we're in another natural law moment right now, and I think Leo XIV would be very helpful at highlighting how natural law thinking can help us navigate some of these questions. And then lastly, all of the, from JFK on, Catholic politicians who said, I'm going to leave the faith at the door, they're running afoul of Libertas. And it's exactly what Leo was criticizing with the heresy that he dubbed Americanism, the idea that we can just separate our faith from public life. So it's not just that we need natural law as we think through these questions, we also need the eternal law. And we as Catholic citizens should bring the fullness of who and what we are and what we believe to be true to bear on questions of law and public policy. And so I would fully expect to see Leo go there as well as we're thinking through questions of right and wrong, justice, the common good, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. Dr. Pekalik, tell us about the encyclical Arcanum and what it suggests, what it would have suggested about the breakdown of the family in the 20th century.
That's a lot to answer, but I'll try to do it in two parts. I was delighted to see everybody here. I thought maybe we could take this on the road. There's like a demand for a Pope Leo road show. But then I realized it's so cold outside that this was your refuge. The letter Arcanum Divinae is subtitled in English on Christian marriage. And I was thinking, although I wasn't planning to mention it, it's great that it follows Ryan's reflections on Libertas, in part because that very bold statement by John Stuart Mill, at the back end of On Liberty, he says, well, what about divorce, John Stuart Mill? Right, we're not supposed to, you're free to do anything you want as long as it doesn't sort of physically harm anybody. At the back end of On Liberty, he says, what about divorce? He says, well, this is a very tricky case. And he says, because particularly if you create a child, it's one of the most responsible things a human being can do. And so by responsible, he means, well, it really isn't clear that you should be free to walk away. And it's an amazing, he vitiates in a single sentence his entire document. So even Mill really wasn't a million, particularly because of this question of marriage. And so marriage is the sort of eternal, it's the eternal taunt to all of our notions of liberty. It really is today. So briefly, this is a tremendous and blessedly brief document, which you should just read. There's nothing more instructive than to read Pope Leo in his own words. And so where I can get away with it before I'm done, I will just read you what Pope Leo said. This was written in 1880, which is the third year of his pontificate. So this was really on his heart and mind as he began his reign. One way to think about Pope Leo, by the way, is that the length of his reign mirrors John Paul II's, or, can you mirror it before? It precedes. He is the Pope who reigned, so he's elected in 1878, John Paul II in 1978, and he reigns almost the same exact amount of time. So these are two great popes who close out their respective centuries. Okay, so Arcanum, so one of the things I do when I teach, what are the sources of Arcanum? So one of the things you should do when you read an encyclical, go online and find these encyclicals, read the title, and then scroll all the way to the bottom. Read nothing. Go all the way to the bottom. The bottom will tell you when it was written, and then you want to scroll through the sources. This is so important because frequently people behave in a very non-Catholic way. They behave as if these letters are innovations, or they're kind of invented by the current pontiff. And this can, if interpreted incorrectly, devolve into a kind of ultramontanism. Whatever is the policy of the church is whatever this current pope happens to say. So you want to go and look at the sources, and what you find, in fact, I wrote down just a handful of them, ones that you would recognize, and you wouldn't recognize the other half of them. They're from obscure texts that we don't know, but he's citing Ephesians, Corinthians, Hebrews, Acts, all of the Gospels, St. Jerome, St. Augustine, St. Ambrose, the Council of Trent, and the Roman Catechism, the Council of Florence, canon law, and the encyclical letters of Pius the Sixth from 1773, Pius the Seventh, Pius the Eighth, Gregory the 16th, and Pius the Ninth. This is not something he sort of sketched off in a vision, like, this is how I see marriage. This is really drawn from the well of the church. And all of the encyclicals have that character. Okay, finally, so this is what comes behind Arcanum. What comes after Arcanum? Father Robert will tell us about Rerum Novarum and how much comes after Rerum Novarum. Arcanum is similar. So the great encyclical on Christian marriage written by Pius XI in 1930 is written on the 50th anniversary of Arcanum. And in a manner of speaking, Familiaris Consortio is the 100th anniversary of Arcanum. You'll say, well, but it was written or was published in 1981, so we're off by a year. Not so fast. The Synod on the Family was established in 1980, and John Paul II certainly had in mind the anniversary of Arcanum. So this is a document which behaves in all respects like Rerum Novarum. It's 45 paragraphs, which is blessedly short. I will tell you there's two ways to think about an encyclical letter, or two things you have to always know. What does it show up to say, and why does it show up to say it then? Right? Because the teachings on marriage aren't new. I mean, he's not going to tell us anything we didn't know about marriage, not really, right? He might say it in a new way. So what does it show up to say? And so I'm actually going to grab from paragraph 39. He says, marriage was not instituted by the will of man, but from the very beginning. Does that sound familiar? Has anyone read any of the texts of John Paul II? But from the very beginning, by the authority and command of God. And that could be the theme. It's not the theme. That could be the theme. This marriage is a divine institution. So what does he show up to say? It's two things. It's two things, unity and permanence. And unity is not what you think. It's not that marriage is between one man and one woman. That's not the unity. The unity that he means is no plural marriage. No multiple wives, and certainly no multiple husbands, but especially no multiple wives. And permanence, by which he means no divorce. All right, so those are the two things he shows up to say. He then says, in paragraph 3, right at the beginning, he says something really interesting. He says, look, in every age, now remember this is the beginning of his pontificate, where he's 3 years into a 25-year pontificate. He says, look, in every age, what is the job of the church? To show up and set in order what might have become deranged in human society. Okay, all right, interesting. Very interesting, he says society, so I'm going to make the point to you now. This is a signal point about this letter on marriage, that Arcanum belongs to what we call Catholic social thought or teaching. And if you were under the impression that Catholic social teaching just meant the sort of economic or labor and capital encyclicals or things about property, Father Robert will cover, I'm here to inform you, you are mistaken. Why do I say that? Because he says right at the beginning, whatever has become deranged in human society, he doesn't say in your homes, in your households. He's about to tell you that if we get it wrong about marriage, nothing will go well. You can get everything right about labor and capital, but nothing will go well for you. So this is right at the beginning, he says this. All right, so I already said what he shows up to say, unity and perpetuity. Why does he say that? And he does two things. It's very interesting. The first thing he says, why? He says, well, forever we've been getting this wrong. Okay, so in other words, he says, I could have said this any time. And he covers many things. He says all the way back to ancient times. The Jews were constantly agitating for divorce, he said, by the hardness of their hearts. He says nations forget the right laws. He says, of course, states constantly pass laws as if heads of state had authority over marriages. And you can think of all kinds of examples that he means. And he says, well, then we have the plurality of wives. And he says, and he refers also to sort of approved concubines. He's like, there's this and that. And then there's a really interesting passage where he says, well, and it constantly comes to pass that, you find husbands ordering their wives around. While the husbands run, this is a direct quote, run unbridled into lust and shame with slaves and servants, and wives become used for gratification. Girls are bought and sold like so much merchandise. Power is given to fathers or husbands to inflict capital punishment on wives or daughters. Well, this isn't rampant in the West, but it certainly is very common in parts of the world still today. So this is a great example of the Pope speaking to the world. He's speaking to the world about this very, so he's not a feminist, but he thinks actually marriage is a signal institution to protect the dignity of women. All right. And then he comes around to saying, well, of course, Christ comes to perfect all of these things. and then he says, but wait a minute, but why today? All right, everything we just said is sort of a constant theme. And he says, why today? And he more or less lists about three special things. He says, first, and this is really something that many of these things are rampant. He says, first, the rejection of the authority of the church over matrimony. So the introduction, and this is his language, of so-called civil marriages. All right? He says there's no such thing as civil marriage. He says marriage is regulated by the church. So he calls this out, and he says, look, emperors, kings, regimes, they always want to do this. They want to say, well, we have control over the contract, and the priest can handle the sacrament. He says, no, can do. Sorry. He says the contract is inseparable from the sacrament. The second thing he says is the major push for the liberalization of divorce laws, which, according to Pope Leo, he says, has come about thanks to the wicked aim of the socialists and the communists. So he doesn't see his teaching on marriage and family as separate from his other teaching against the socialists and the communists. He never does, and you'll find this throughout Pope Leo. And then, of course, the French Revolution had really devastated family life and aimed to do so directly. And the third thing, so remember this part about unity, plurality of wives? Well, you should be thinking what you are thinking. All right, when are those Mormons coming around? So the Pope says, well, in our own time, he says Mormons, San-Simonians, well, they're socialists and communists. He says, of these, the Mormons, now aren't you wondering about the Mormons? 1830, they were sort of established. The Mormons began evangelizing in England already in the late 1830s. Joseph Smith announced plural marriage in 1843. Brigham Young had 20 wives and 57 children that we know of. Throughout the 50s and the 60s in the United States, there were many struggles over plural marriage. And in 1862, did you know this? The Morrill Act, Anti-Bigamy Act, criminalized plural marriage in the United States. Lincoln declined to enforce it mainly because it was a bad time in 1862, right? He had his hands full. But actually in 1879, the Supreme Court upheld the Anti-Bigamy Act. 1879, and then finally in 1882, the Edmunds Act declared polygamy a felony, and it disenfranchised those who practiced it. 1882. Oh, when was Arcanum written? 1880. He's thinking about all of this and reading it. So again, this is a pope who's thinking about the entire world. And so I'll just end with one last, this is why he shows up to say this. And so I'll just end with one last paragraph to persuade you that he thinks of this as a social problem and not merely as a problem that you might have in your home, in your household. He says, in paragraph 29, he says, "Truly, it's hardly possible to describe how great are the evils that flow from divorce. Matrimonial contracts are by it made variable, mutual kindness is weakened, deplorable inducements to unfaithfulness are supplied. Harm is done to the education and training of children. Occasion is afforded for the breaking up of homes. The seeds of dissension are sown among families. The dignity of womanhood is lessened and brought low. Women run the risk of being deserted after having ministered to the pleasures of men. Nothing has such power to lay waste families and destroy the wealth of nations." Did you hear that? The wealth of nations. "As the corruption of morals brought about by divorces, and divorces are in the highest degree hostile to the prosperity of families and states." It's hard to believe, it's hard to think that this isn't part of social teaching, right? He thinks that he's here to sort of set to right what has been deranged in human society. So with that, we will pass it over to Father Robert.
Thank you, Catherine. Father Sirico, so on Rerum Novarum, if you could give us a sense of Leo XIII's economic vision and even how it has unfolded in the sort of subsequent, particularly 100 years. So.
Yeah, what is striking to me, just listening to my three colleagues, all to my left, I might add, is the integrated nature of Leo's thinking, owing greatly to his Thomistic formation. Because what you have here is that not just separate issues of liberty, of family, and now I'm going to talk about economy, but how it's all interwoven. You see this in Rerum Novarum, which is written in 1890. And think of the backdrop of what's going on. You've heard a bit of the backdrop already, but I just want to underscore a number of things as it relates to his concerns about economy. Of course, there's the Industrial Revolution, which we've talked about, and there is the rise of communism. And what communism, Marx is very active. Remember that in just a few years after this encyclical, 14 or 15 years later, 18 years later, you're going to have the Russian Revolution. And this all begins to foment, and it's the claim that Marx and his comrades are making on the worker, that we are the defenders of the worker. And this is all going to begin to play itself out, and a notion of class division, class struggle that is being promoted. But also what comes into Marx's consideration, and you could in one way see Rerum Novarum as a direct refutation of a book that was compiled posthumously by Marx's colleague Engels, which was entitled The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. And what Marx is going through here is attacking marriage, attacking capital, attacking private property, and seeing all of that as supporting a bourgeois notion of how people should live their lives. What Leo does is attack that and rip it apart in all these various encyclicals in various ways, and now we come to the economics. And here is one of the most striking things, and I think there's a lot of confusion over Rerum Novarum because, especially in the United States, because its reception in the United States was in many ways, I think, obfuscated and redirected through the writings of a priest who really was at the beginning of what was the preliminary to the Catholic Bishops' Conference, which was called the Catholic War Council. And this is Monsignor John A. Ryan. Monsignor John A. Ryan was able to convince many of the people in the church at the time that essentially Rerum Novarum was a semi-socialist document. And he does this because Leo is defending the rights of the workers and the priority of the family over and against the cruelty at times of the Industrial Revolution, the great hardships. But Leo is anchoring his defense of the family in what he calls the sanctity of private property. Now, socialism, semi or otherwise, is going to be appalled by the notion that private property is holy. And it is holy because of the way in which it emerges. And in this sense, it's a very Lockean description of man's labor being mixed with the earth and then drawing from the material things of the world, drawing things out and making them available in the process of economic production. But what Leo is emphasizing constantly is that while private property is holy, it is not absolute. And that the family, the stability of the family, the stability of the economy, the not redistribution but distribution of wealth, and here he juxtaposes himself from the Marxist coercive way of government-dominant central planning efforts to ensure the well-being of people. What he says is access to labor, in effect, that is, man's access to labor, is what will ensure the stability of the family and the stability of the economy. So all of this is a several-year project, as you can see, reflecting back and repudiating the communist and the socialist experiment. He wants to take back the claims of Marx into the bosom of the church because of the church's knowledge of who human beings are. Now, there's so much to say here, and we're all saying it. But what happens shortly after this is that he will write a letter to the United States, and this is where we come into it to bring it up. This is a letter that was directed to Cardinal Gibbons, who at the time was the prelate of the United States. He was the Archbishop of Baltimore. And he writes a letter, and I don't want to spend a lot of time to give you the background of it all, but it's all very important. But the significant thing, this letter is called Testem Benevolentiae, and it deals with the question of Americanism, which Ryan alluded to. And it's very interesting if you read this letter carefully. He never says that Americans are guilty of Americanism. He says if this is what we mean by Americanism, we need to put this aside. And of course, Cardinal Gibbons and others in the church in the United States respond and say that is not what we think of as Americanism. And really, the Americanism of the American church is very much in harmony with what Rerum Novarum is calling for in terms of the rule of law. Remember the famous line, the poetic line from the America the Beautiful, confirm thy law in self-control, conform thy soul in self-control and thy government in law. And this is exactly the kind of theme that is emerging. So in many respects, if you hear Americanism, you have to be very careful, like you have to hear the word liberalism very carefully and understand what is meant by it, that there are two forces, the kind of extreme libertine force that is emerging through John Stuart Mill, for example, through the French Revolution, and another way of seeing human liberty as the servant of the family and the protector of the family, which in an odd way Marx saw more clearly than many modern capitalists do. What I want to close on is two things. 100 years after this encyclical, Rerum Novarum, is written, John Paul II, who we've already seen the parallels between Leo and John Paul, but this is another one, he writes, Centesimus Annus, which is the 100th anniversary, the 100th year, that's what Centesimus Annus means, of Rerum Novarum, in which he states explicitly at the outset that he's seeking now to update, in the modern context, what Leo was dealing with 100 years previous. And in that encyclical, and for those of you who are business people, if you have not had the chance to read this encyclical, I really encourage you, because it is the manifesto of the Christian entrepreneur. In this encyclical, he, of course, affirms the right of private property. He articulates and elaborates something that is in Leo, that is the principle of subsidiarity, succinctly said that it's where needs are best met at their most local level, that legitimates government interventions, but only as an exception, not as a norm, and that they should withdraw once the natural society is functioning again as a help. And what he then says, here's a beautiful line. It's the manifesto of the entrepreneur, of the Christian entrepreneur. He says that the market and entrepreneurship casts light back onto the gospel. Imagine that we learn the fuller meaning of the gospel. You learn it by your activities in the market. And this is now, of course, in this 100 years, a greater insight into this through people like Saint Jose Maria Escrivá and others who have written on this topic. Finally, this is a great opportunity, and I can't imagine that this is not somewhere in Leo XIV's mind, that he has an opportunity now in the face of a new revolution, a new social stress, to bring to bear these perennial truths of the faith in this holistic way that Thomism provides us, how we can think about things as a whole and not just separate antagonistic parts. And what I'm very hopeful about, as discreet as Leo so far has been, Pope Leo has been so far, in presenting himself. I mean, it was very significant, and I think everyone I've spoken to, every American I've spoken to, I was in Rome during all of this, and I was on the air when this American Pope comes out, and they all looked at me and said, "You're an American." And of course, what's the next question? Do you know him? I get that. I say, I'm from Brooklyn. Do you know so-and-so in Brooklyn? But what I think Leo has the opportunity to do, especially in the face of AI and the other challenges to the family, far more radical but prescient in Leo XIII. I mean, the whole description of the family is the struggles we're having now at an even more radical level, that I think Leo XIV, as an American, I thought it was very significant that when he was standing on that balcony and addressed the world, he never spoke in English. That was very significant to my mind, because he is the Bishop of Rome, and he is the pastor of the whole church. But nonetheless, his formation was made possible and informed by his experience as an American, all of which I've attempted to address in terms of the economy. So I think we have a real opportunity to create a renaissance of understanding of what entrepreneurship is, of what the purpose of business is, the integral nature of the family to business, that the business serves the family and not the family business, and all of this in a highly technological age. So I think it's providential that all of this is happening, and nobody can say what Leo is going to say. I mean, as we are sitting here talking, I understand that he is sketching the outline of his first encyclical. And maybe when we're here next year, you can see if I was right in my prediction that these are the kinds of themes that he will draw upon to initiate his pontificate. I'm just thrilled that I'm alive to see this happening in our world right now, and I hope that it encourages you after such a difficult and beleaguering moment in the church, encourages your faith and your fidelity in God's providence for what I think is going to unfold.
Thank you. I'm sure you've been impressed with the depth of insight from our panelists. For this final round of questioning, you are going to be amazed at their brevity. I'm giving them 60 seconds each for a quick question. Father Pine, 60 seconds. So after the Second Vatican Council, it seemed like the church once again moved away again from St. Thomas Aquinas. Where do you think we go next?
Yeah. I think we're seeing a resurgence, and I think one of the reasons for which is that St. Thomas's teaching corresponds to human nature. And I think maybe just one thing that we can say in 60 seconds is sometimes when we use politics or even ecclesiastical politics as our governing paradigm for understanding the movement of history, we find ourselves often kind of like storm-tossed and even shipwrecked. But I think when we take an eschatological view with the understanding that Christ has won the victory and that he leads us into the fullness of truth by his own mysterious designs, that we can have confidence that the natural law as it kind of wells up within each human heart will find a corresponding response from the Lord in his generosity. And I see St. Thomas's teaching as providing just that, supplying us with a vocabulary and a grammar whereby to understand our faith and express it with certainty and confidence. So it's not a mistake that we always see him come back. Sometimes he falls away from prominence, but he always comes back.
All right. Thank you. Dr. Pekalik, what would the Pope need to do to carry on the legacy of Arcanum? 60 seconds.
Okay, yeah, very quick. Okay, one sentence. Reform the annulment process. Right. So we really haven't handled, we haven't handled, like, we've moved on. Like the marriage crisis is now whether two men can get married or two women can get married, and then it'll be, or three, right? It's like, and so like, you know, the perversion keeps marching forward, and it's like we haven't even caught up to the last, like we're still fighting the last battle, but the thing keeps moving. And a lot of times when I read Arcanum, I think maybe we should just continue to beat the drum of divorce and just, right, because we've really lost that sense of what an affront divorce is to God's plan. So we need to, I think, refocus our energies on that. And obviously it's a grave scandal that the world sees annulments as a Catholic divorce, and that we have to end that. That has to be reformed dramatically. So those are the things I would focus on. And then certainly this question of plurality of wives. I mean, certainly in Pope Leo's mind, he meant to refer to kind of promiscuity, generally concubinage. We live in a society in which everyone's like the woman at the well with 7 husbands. Right? You have 7 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband, actually, right? And this is really how most people live. Sociologists call it the marriage go round, like multiple partners, either in or out of marriage. And this is no prettier today than it was 100 years ago.
Thank you. Dr. Anderson. So civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, separation of church and state, etc. What, from the Libertas perspective, 60 seconds.
Yeah, so the reason Andrew asked that question is that Pope Leo in Libertas is a critic of all of those things in Libertas, if you understand those things in the way that I think most continental Europeans at the time were thinking about them. As Father Sirico mentioned, when he sends this letter to Cardinal Gibbons sends a letter back saying, yeah, no one in America thinks that. I think the exact quote is something like, not a single bishop, not a single priest, dare I say it, not a single lay person that actually knows their faith believes what you're describing as Americanism. But I think it's worth pointing out here something, and yet, 100 years later, many Americans did believe that. So Leo was clearly on to something, right? And so I think, like, as American Catholics, we should realize that, like, America and Catholicism are not one and the same, but nor are they fundamentally opposed. And I think the temptation that we see in today's discourse is either to equate the cross with the flag or to think that they are fundamentally opposite. And I think as Catholic Americans, we should see there's a tension, but it's a reconcilable tension, and that America will be at her best as Catholics are more authentically Catholic in the public square. right? That this nation can't actually thrive if we don't have like serious religious believers actually shaping what our laws look like. So I think for all those civil liberties that Andrew mentioned, we need to have a Catholic understanding of those civil liberties, not the secularist understanding. And those are different substantive concepts.
Thank you. Father Sirico, 60 seconds. Define integralism and say what Leo would have said about it.
Well, I think it's pretty clear. Integralism is this idea. It's really a form of theocracy. It is a form or presumption that it in effect is a denial of the God and Caesar distinction that Jesus makes when he says he looks at the coins. It's an attempt to bring about the church's triumph in society through the state. I would say that Leo would repudiate that and does without mentioning integralism through this principle of subsidiarity, that there's a distinction between society and the state, between the community and the state, between God and Caesar, that we have to have forms of constraint, but that the dominant and most radical form of constraint is not power, which is external to the person, but authority. And that requires a formation of conscience that can result in forms of constraint that go much deeper than a law can. And Father, if I may give you a bumper sticker summation of what you said before, Yves Simon said that the natural law will always bury its undertakers.
Thank you, Father. Since our panelists have shown such remarkable brevity, we have time for one question from the audience.
But do we have time for an answer?
I didn't say that. Do we have a question? Yes, Diego.
Andrew, Lord, thank you for this. I'll make it brief. Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, written over 100 years ago, identified the contrast between the soft tyranny of drugs, distraction, pleasure, versus, if you remember, the savages who lived according to human law. Will our Catholic schools and our Catholic hierarchy be able to encourage us to become savages in the face of transhumanism, augmenting our reality with infrared vision, not talking about restoring walk to the paralytic or movement to the arm or sight to the blind, but IR vision and robotic lives and super intelligence. Is our church ready to contend with that, what I think is a reality within the next generation?
I would say not only is the church ready to do that, the church is the only one that can do that. And the reason for that is if you consider the Catholic Church, it's the longest ongoing institution in human history. We understand humanity, or not we, but the church in her treasure understands humanity better than anyone else. And the real danger in our society that is the foundation of all the other dangers is an anthropological question. Who is man? Who are we? Because what you have just addressed is that question. The whole homosexual thing is that question. The whole transgender thing, all of the economy, marriage, all of these things have to do with who man is. And the church knows who man is because Jesus Christ reveals man to himself. So I would say no one else has the answer to this question the way we do.
So I'm going to offer a friendly minor disagreement. I agree with when Father says that the church is the only one who can answer this, but I'm going to slightly disagree in saying I don't think the church is currently ready. And I actually think that's why the people in this room are so important to help the church get ready. I think there are pockets of the church that are ready for this. I think there are pockets of the church that have completely gone along with the culture on these issues. There's just as much homosexuality and transgenderism and wokeism inside of the church as there is in the mainstream culture for certain pockets of the church. Right? So that's why when you say, is the church currently ready? Yes and no. Is it the only institution that can actually save authentic humanism? Absolutely yes. It's the only one. To get the entire church ready, the people in this room and the apostolates that we serve, we have work to do.
I accept that corrective.
Well, thank you again to our wonderful panelists. Thank you for joining us, and stay warm tonight.
Peace be with you. Friends, we're now at the fourth Sunday of Lent, and this season we're in